I am 28 years old now, and the events I am about to recount took place 2 years ago, just a few days before Christmas. I had decided to take a full week away from the office. At my company, we were allowed to set our own schedules, and I had saved up enough remote work days to stay home for the entirety of that week. I was aware that a severe winter storm was forecasted to hit the city during those days, and with the holiday approaching, I preferred the comfort of my own home for a few days of quiet productivity. The remote work policy was straightforward. The primary focus was on completing tasks by their deadlines, and beyond that, each person was free to manage their time however they saw fit. There were a few other guidelines to follow, but they were not particularly strict, which gave me the freedom to work a schedule that suited my personal habits. I have always been someone who enjoys waking up late and continuing my work well into the night. On that particular day, I began my workday around noon. The initial hours went by in a slow and peaceful manner. I sipped my coffee while attempting to focus on my tasks, as the wind outside began to pick up strength, rattling the window beside my desk, while the snow started its gentle descent. By 3 or 4 in the afternoon, a heavy darkness had settled over the landscape, brought on by thick clouds and a layer of snow that had blanketed the entire neighborhood. I considered heading out to pick up some dinner, but after seeing the condition of the roads, I changed my mind and resolved to stay indoors for the rest of the night. I returned to my desk and continued working for another 2 hours. The sun had long since set, and the winter storm had reached its full intensity. I kept the curtains open so that I could watch the snow fall while I sat at my workstation. Suddenly, and without any warning, I caught a glimpse of a flash of light outside. I turned my head quickly and saw a thin, moving beam of light.
There was no doubt that it was the light from a handheld flashlight. I leaned back in my chair and stared out the window for about 10 seconds, tracking the movement of the light until my curiosity became too much to ignore, prompting me to stand up and walk over to the glass to see what was going on. It was freezing cold out there, and I could not imagine why anyone would be wandering around in such weather. I tried to peer toward the side of the house through the window pane. I caught sight of the light once more, but before I could figure out where it was coming from or see who was carrying it, it vanished abruptly. I did not know if it had been switched off or if the person had stepped behind something to hide. The darkness was thick, and the falling snow obscured most of my vision. Since there was nothing left to see, I went back to my desk and took my seat. To be honest, I just assumed a neighbor might have lost a pet in the storm, or was perhaps searching for something they had misplaced. I did not let it worry me too much and tried to focus on my work while the storm continued to rage outside. Over the next 2 hours, the house made a series of repetitive creaks and groans, as if the structure itself were adjusting to the sheer force of the wind. Yet several times, I thought I heard a sound that was sharper and more distinct. It was enough to make me pause my work and lift my head, waiting for it to repeat so I could discern its origin, but nothing followed. I told myself it must have been the usual settling of the house. The notion of anything else felt distant and illogical. Until, that is, I heard a sudden and heavy thud. It wasn't merely a knock against the wall or the howling of the wind. It sounded as if something had actually shattered. Worst of all, the sound seemed to emanate from deep within the house itself. I stood up from my desk immediately and moved into the hallway, met only by silence.
Then I began to descend the stairs toward the basement, my heart hammering against my ribs. There was another bang. Truthfully, I wasn't frightened enough yet to search every corner of the home, especially given the lack of further noise or obvious signs of intrusion. I started back up toward my desk and was nearly at the top of the stairs when I heard a sudden, soft click. In the very next moment, the entire house was plunged into total darkness. The power was out. I stood motionless for a full second. The darkness was thick and suffocating, and with the snowstorm raging outside, no light filtered in through the windows. I couldn't even see my own hand in front of my face. I assumed the storm had caused a blackout, or perhaps a circuit breaker had tripped. I began to navigate the stairs very slowly, feeling for each step with my foot, moving cautiously through the void until I reached the lower hallway. The basement door, where the fuse box was located, sat at the end of this corridor, so I began to inch along the wall, trailing my hand against it to keep my bearings. But then, I heard something. I stopped dead in my tracks. There was a faint sound, a muffled shuffling, and it was coming from behind the basement door. The sound grew closer, and then came the soft creak of the basement door slowly swinging open. I felt my eyes go wide as I stared down the hallway into the pitch black. I took a step back and then slipped silently into the open bathroom right beside me. I couldn't see anything, and I felt that closing the door would only give away my position, so I left it ajar. Moments later, I began to hear slow, quiet footsteps padding down the hallway. I held my breath, desperate to remain silent. The footsteps drew closer and closer until I felt they were standing directly in front of the bathroom door. Then they passed. The footsteps moved right by the open door, no more than 2 or 3 feet away from me.
I didn't see the person at all. That was how absolute the darkness was. They continued moving slowly until they reached the stairs, and from that point on, the floor was carpeted, so I heard nothing more. Suddenly, the sound of the snowstorm outside rose up again to drown out everything else, as if it had grown sharper and more intense, amplifying the hollow silence and the low rumble within the house. It was possible that the person had come to a halt at the foot of the stairs and was perhaps still standing there, but I assumed they had continued upward. I made the decision to flee. I stepped out of the bathroom and moved blindly toward the other side of the house, reaching out with my hands to keep from colliding with the walls. I reached the garage door, grabbed my keys, and slipped out through the side door to reach my car in the driveway. I drove away immediately and used the car's emergency system to contact the police. As I had expected, by the time the police arrived, there was no one left. According to the officer's findings, the intruder had cut the power first before heading directly upstairs, going straight to my office and then to the bedroom, without venturing anywhere else in the house. This meant they weren't wandering aimlessly, they were looking specifically for me. The most terrifying realization was that this person likely knew me and was well acquainted with the layout of my home, enough to navigate it in total darkness and go directly to my office where they expected me to be. Perhaps it was someone I spoke with on a regular basis, someone I would never have suspected of harboring such frightening intentions. The incident left me questioning everyone. I moved to a different location, carrying with me a lingering sense of distrust toward any coworker or acquaintance I wasn't particularly close to. Since the move, nothing else has happened. I hope I never have to provide another update to this story, but if anything does occur, I will let you know.
This took place around the Christmas season last year, likely in that quiet stretch of time between Christmas Day and the coming of the new year. I had returned to my small hometown to spend the winter break from university, yet even in that season of rest, I still found myself tethered to bills and the weight of various obligations. Consequently, whenever I was not occupied with my family, I spent my hours making deliveries through the DoorDash application. The snow was falling steadily that evening, though it had not yet gathered enough strength to make the roads truly hazardous. Nevertheless, the flurry was sufficient to keep most people tucked away in the warmth of their homes, choosing the comfort of their living rooms over venturing out into the cold for a meal. Nights such as these were ideal for earning a decent wage. The orders flowed in with a steady rhythm until the hour approached 10 in the evening. After that time, the pace began to slacken, yet the requests did not cease entirely, and I continued to receive the occasional sporadic delivery call. This specific order appeared as ordinary as any other, save for the fact that it was located somewhat further away than my usual routes, requiring a drive of roughly 20 minutes. My town is small in population but expansive in geography, with many residences scattered along its periphery, nestled deep within the surrounding forests. Upon arriving at the designated drop-off point, a sense of immediate unease began to settle over me. The directions guided me away from the safety of the main road onto a narrow woodland lane, and eventually toward what appeared to be a dirt trail meant to lead further into the timber, though it was now entirely buried beneath a blanket of snow. There was no evidence of a snowplow's passage, nor the markings of a shovel. I could discern no light whatsoever, neither from a porch lamp nor any form of exterior illumination. There was only the profound darkness of the woods. Remaining within the safety of my vehicle, I called the customer, suspecting that there might have been some mistake regarding the address. He answered the phone almost instantly. The man sounded to be in his mid-30s, and given the deep, raspy quality of his voice, it was clear that he was a heavy smoker. I explained to him that I had reached the location indicated on the map,
but I could see no cleared entrance, no house, nor anything else that would suggest a person lived there. He replied that the trail was likely covered in snow, speaking with a tone that suggested the answer should have been obvious to me. I informed him that while I believed I could see where the trail might be, I did not feel comfortable attempting to navigate my car through such conditions. He then responded sarcastically, stating that this was precisely why he had requested a delivery in the first place, adding that if the order was not going to be brought to him, then what was the point of the service at all? I disagreed with his assessment and felt his reply was both rude and arrogant. Yet in that moment I relented and told him it was fine. I did not want him to cancel the order or leave me a poor rating, particularly after I had already driven such a distance to reach him. Later on, after reviewing the regulations, I learned that if a delivery location is deemed unsafe, the responsibility lies with the customer. But at that particular time, I was uncertain of my rights. Once the call had concluded, I stepped out of the car with the order in my hand. I locked my doors and began to make my way through the snow, venturing toward the thick darkness gathered between the trees. The snow was not particularly deep, yet as the trail was little more than a neglected forest track, I felt certain my car would have struggled and likely become stranded. Furthermore, it was exceedingly difficult to discern the actual path. I was simply attempting to follow what I perceived to be a gap between the trees, but without any lights to guide my way, I truly did not know where I was headed. I found myself constantly turning to look back, watching as my car receded further into the distance. It was the only thing that gave me any sense of perspective, for what lay ahead was nothing but absolute darkness and an indistinguishable forest. Suddenly, I heard a sound to my left. It was a crisp, crunching noise, precisely like the sound of a boot pressing into the snow. It was distant, just on the edge of my hearing, but it was clear enough to make my entire body grow rigid. I peered in that direction and tried to use the light from my phone, but it proved to be of no use at all. I saw nothing and heard no further sounds, so I continued on my way. The cold began to seep into my bones, and the unending darkness before me made me reconsider everything I was doing. I had believed that by now I would have seen the house or some indication that I was traveling in the right direction, but there was nothing. I stopped dead in my tracks and stood perfectly still for several seconds, realizing all at once how very strange this situation had become. It may sound absurd, but it was only in that moment that a terrifying possibility occurred to me. Perhaps there was no house here at all. Perhaps this was nothing more than a ruse to draw me out to this desolate place. The thought of that, while standing alone in a dark and snow-covered woods, was truly chilling. I pulled out my phone and decided to call the customer once more. I told myself that if they failed to answer or tried to convince me to keep going, I would leave immediately and cancel the order. I pressed the call button and held the phone to my ear. It rang twice, and then I caught sight of something in my peripheral vision. I turned quickly and saw a distant light flickering between the trees. In the very next moment, it vanished.
Half a second later, the call was disconnected. I did not stop to think or hesitate. I began to run with every ounce of my strength in the direction I had come from. The sound of the snow crunching beneath my feet drowned out all other noise, including the possibility that someone might be chasing me from behind, which made the experience even more harrowing. I had no idea what might be lurking in my wake. I ran until I reached my car, and before I even reached the door, I noticed that something was amiss. The vehicle was leaning to one side. That was when I saw one of the tires was flat. It had been slashed. I got into the car immediately, started the engine, and sped away from that place as quickly as possible. I called the police while I was driving, but aside from asking a few questions, they were almost entirely useless and did not seem to take the matter seriously. To me, however, the truth of what had happened was perfectly clear. That man had been leading me with deliberate intent into the depths of the forest for some dark purpose of his own, and he had gone to the terrible extreme of slashing my tire, acting with the singular goal of either pinning me to that spot or ensuring that I could not make my escape. I do not know, nor do I have any desire to uncover what I might have discovered had I continued my journey into those woods, or what grim fate might have eventually overtaken me in the shadows. The journey began in the early morning hours as I set out behind the wheel with the simple goal of reaching my sister's home in Montana before the weekend arrived. It was meant to be a straightforward winter drive, nothing more than a quiet transit across the frozen plains,
with only myself, the steady presence of my aging but reliable Subaru, and the bitter warmth of a cup of poor gas station coffee to keep me company. The world remained steady until I turned northward into the more desolate stretches of the highway, and then the snow began its slow descent. It started as a faint, rhythmic dusting, but as the sun dipped below the horizon, the flakes grew heavy and relentless. Soon, the landscape transformed into a dense, impenetrable wall of white, so thick that my headlights seemed to falter against the void. After an hour of navigating that blinding shroud, the road vanished entirely beneath the drifts, leaving me uncertain if my tires were still finding the pavement at all. Tension took hold of me, and I resolved to pull over at the very first sign of shelter to wait out the fury of the storm. Perhaps 15 minutes after that decision, a faint glimmering light caught my eye through the haze at the edge of the path. The whiteout was so absolute that I could not discern a single sign before I made the turn toward that beckoning glow. I found myself in a small parking lot where 3 cars sat. One of them was already nearly lost beneath a heavy shroud of snow, while the other 2 vehicles appeared to have arrived only recently, their forms still distinct against the elements. Once I parked, the silhouette and structure of the building revealed it to be a modest roadside cafe. Though I had held on to the hope of finding a hotel or an inn, I knew I could go no further, and so I decided to step inside for another cup of coffee.
I stepped out into the biting air and hurried through the swirling gale, feeling the deep, invasive chill settle into my very bones as I made for the entrance. This was a world entirely foreign to me, for I am a creature of the city, and I felt like a stranger to this isolated place from the very moment I crossed the threshold. The interior was cramped and weathered with age, featuring a simple bar situated near the door where 2 men sat nursing their coffee while a lone woman tended to her duties behind the counter. As I pushed the door open, the room was draped in an unsettling, heavy silence. Not a word was spoken, yet everyone turned toward me in unison and offered a greeting at the exact same moment, as if my arrival had interrupted a shared and uncomfortable stillness. I told myself I was overthinking the oddity of it all, and I took a seat near the 2 men. It became clear that they had both sought refuge here for the same reason I had, simply looking to escape the wrath of the blizzard. I ordered a coffee from the woman, and with the warm cup in my hand, I moved to a seat by the front window to watch the snow continue its slow burial of our vehicles. Yet an unsettling feeling began to take hold of me as I looked toward one of the men at the bar. He was an older man, perhaps in his 50s, and the only way I can truly describe him is to say that he looked halfway to the grave. Whether it was the influence of the storm, the weight of boredom, or simply the toll of a difficult life, I cannot say, but his appearance was profoundly haunting. What was most peculiar, however, was that the moment I took my place by the window, the low hum of conversation withered away once more, and that heavy, oppressive silence reclaimed the room just as it had when I first stepped through the door. We remained there in that stillness for several minutes, suspended in a quiet that felt almost physical, until one of the men rose abruptly from his seat.
He muttered something about trying to reach a nearby cabin before the roads became entirely impassable, but to this, no one offered a reply. I watched him through the glass as he ventured out to his vehicle and sat within its dark frame for a minute or so, perhaps waiting for the engine to find its warmth against the biting cold. Shortly thereafter, the second man stood as well, and both of them departed from the diner without another word passing between them. I moved away from the window and returned to the counter, asking the woman working there what the story was with those 2 travelers. She merely offered a tired shrug and explained that they had arrived at the same moment, appearing to have been locked in some sort of heated argument in the parking lot before entering the building. After that, she noted, they had hardly spoken a word to one another. I dismissed the matter as little more than the fraying nerves of the road or some lingering traveler's resentment. I lingered at the bar for a while longer, engaging her in idle talk about the worsening snow and other trivialities that served to pass the time. For the next 30 minutes, no other soul crossed the threshold of that diner. At last, I returned to the window to gauge the accumulation of snow and see if the fury of the storm had abated even slightly. It was then that I noticed the cars belonging to the 2 men were still resting in the lot, yet the unsettling truth was that neither man was inside his vehicle, nor were they anywhere to be seen nearby. They had simply vanished. A sudden, sharp chill raced down my spine, for a significant amount of time had passed since they had walked out those doors.
They could not possibly have remained out in the teeth of that storm for so long. Driven by a mounting unease, I moved toward the main entrance to get a closer look at the scene. I decided then to step out into the night and inspect the grounds for myself.
The bitter cold struck my face instantly, and though the snowfall was no longer as frantic as it had been, the visibility remained treacherous and dim. Aside from the mournful whistle of the rising winds, the world was eerily, profoundly quiet. There was not a single trace of the men to be found. A wave of anxiety washed over me, so potent that I felt an immediate, desperate urge to leave that place behind. I trudged heavily through the deepening drifts, making my way toward my car with leaden steps. My intent was to start the engine and let it warm for a few moments, returning briefly to the shelter of the diner before I finally set off. But the car would not start. It was not merely a matter of the engine struggling or failing to turn over. Rather, it was utterly unresponsive. There was not a single sound when I turned the key in the ignition. I had arrived at the diner only 40 minutes prior, and my vehicle had performed flawlessly throughout the entirety of my journey until that very moment. Deep within me, a cold certainty took root, the conviction that one of those men was responsible for what was unfolding. This may sound irrational, perhaps even hyperbolic, but my instinct was far too powerful to be ignored. And as I sat there in the driver's seat, still fruitlessly attempting to coax the car to life, I saw someone. One of the men was emerging from the dark line of trees in the woods behind the diner. He was little more than a silhouette, a dense patch of darkness shifting through the swirling white of the snowstorm, but his trajectory was unmistakable as he moved toward the parked cars. I abandoned my useless vehicle in a sudden panic, scrambling out and retreating into the diner, where I threw my weight against the front door and secured the bolt with a trembling hand. The woman behind the counter watched me with a look of bewildered alarm, her voice rising as she demanded to know what was happening and why I had reacted with such desperation.
I offered a hurried, breathless explanation of the figure outside and implored her to summon the authorities immediately. There was a fleeting moment of hesitation in her eyes, a flicker of doubt, but the gravity of my expression eventually moved her to act, and she picked up the phone. Perhaps 60 seconds passed before the man arrived, manifesting out of the gray veil of the storm to confront the glass. He threw his shoulder against the frame, testing the integrity of the lock with a heavy, desperate force. Upon realizing the barrier would not yield, he fixed his gaze directly upon mine through the transparent pane and began to hammer against the door with a rhythmic, violent persistence. His eyes were a map of broken veins, bloodshot and frantic, set within a face so pale and hollow that he retained that unsettling, ghoulish quality of a man already departed from the living. In that silent exchange through the glass, I felt a chilling spark of recognition pass between us. He seemed to understand that I had seen beneath the mask, and that I was no longer an easy mark for whatever he intended. He lingered for no more than 10 heartbeats before turning on his heel and sprinting back toward his own vehicle. By the time the police cruisers arrived, their lights painting the falling snow in rhythmic flashes of red and blue, only 3 cars remained in the lot: mine, the waitress's, and the car belonging to the other patron. The man who had haunted the edge of the woods had fled into the night. Yet the evening did not conclude with the hollow relief of a narrow escape. It did not possess the grace of a story where the threat simply evaporates into the dark. Following a faint, disrupted trail in the fresh powder that led toward the tree line, the officers discovered the body of the other man deep within the woods. Nothing had been taken from him. No wallet or watch was missing, confirming that this was not a crime of desperate theft, but an act of unadulterated, senseless violence. Most chilling of all was the discovery that his car, too, was incapacitated. Their investigation revealed that his ignition wire had been severed in precisely the same manner as mine, a deliberate, surgical strike to ensure he could not flee. It was in that moment of cold realization that the evening's grim architecture became clear. When those 2 men had first arrived at the diner, the predator had taken the opportunity to sabotage his victim's vehicle, effectively tethering him to the spot. He had simply waited for the man to step out into the cold, trailing him like a shadow into the dark. With the engine dead and no avenue for retreat, the victim had either been dragged into the timber or had tried to run, but the conclusion remained tragically inevitable. The howling gale of the blizzard had been so fierce that neither I nor the woman inside the diner had heard a single sound, remaining oblivious to the fact that a life was being extinguished less than 20 feet from the front door. During those 30 minutes I sat inside, warming myself with coffee, that man had also visited my car, severing my ignition cable with the same dark intent he had for the first man. I eventually found my way to the safety of my sister's home, the warmth of her house a stark contrast to the frozen nightmare I had left behind. Apart from a few standard follow-up calls to check on my well-being, the silence regarding an arrest has been absolute. I have heard nothing of that man ever being brought to justice. I do not imagine I will ever find the courage to venture out on a winter road trip again.
Even now, the mere memory of that figure emerging from the tree line amidst the roar of the storm, advancing with such singular, lethal purpose, causes my heart to hammer against my ribs with a renewed and terrible violence.